and thank you for joining us. My name is Rachel, and today I'll be interviewing SomaDetect's Manager of Strategic Partnerships, Bryan Wattie. Bryan has extensive knowledge of the dairy industry as well as dairy technology and has been with SomaDetect from the very beginning. Welcome, Bryan.
Thank you, Rachel.
So to start, can you tell us a little bit about how you started your path into the dairy industry?
Sure. So my whole life I've been around agriculture, but not always cows. My dad's an agronomist, and so he spent the first 20 years of my life managing a government seed farm in New Brunswick. And so things like planting and crop management and agricultural technology were all regular parts of family conversation. In fact, when I was growing up, I was in a part of New Brunswick where we started school early so that we could take 2 weeks off at the end of September to harvest potatoes until the development of the potato harvester that replaced all of this human labor.
Yeah.
And so I was 10 years old when that actually changed in my school.
Yeah.
And so it was always a part of my life, agriculture. And then in school, I was, interested in science and technology, and that led me to pursue engineering, but I didn't always have a focus on doing agricultural engineering. That kind of came from a very specific experience where I attended a global food security conference, and I learned about food processing technologies, food storage, the importance of food technology in terms of all of the steps after harvest that it takes to get a nutritious product to a consumer in their home. And one of the facts from that was really startling to me at the time was that 50% of the food that's grown in the world can be lost post-harvest. And the other thing that was particularly startling, but it makes a lot of sense now that I have a better understanding of biological systems, but it still continues to be really important, is that 70% of the world's water withdrawals, the water that we take out of rivers and groundwater, is used for agriculture as well. Now, that's all part of a cycle.
Right.
Plants transpire and it becomes rain and it comes back down, and some aspects of that can be replenished. But there's also a lot of insecurity around water that can occur, that can lead to conflict. And so it just became really clear to me that water and food were so closely linked. And I mean, it might seem obvious, but it made sense to me to focus on food even if I did want to have an impact on water resources down the road.
Right.
So that year after going to that conference, I hadn't yet chosen what university I wanted to attend or what program I wanted to study. And so I started to look for more agricultural engineering programs and found the bioresource program at McGill. And I did my undergrad and master's there, and I was working as a environmental project manager. And at that time, I wanted to look for new opportunities, get a little bit closer to this goal of working in agriculture, because I had drifted a little bit in my first job out of college. And so I started looking and eventually learned of a new idea called SomaDetect. And so I met the co-founders, Nick and Beth, and introduced them to their co-founder, Barath, after learning a little bit about, the challenges of the technology and what needed to be done to bring it to market at that time.
Right.
And that's when I really started to dig into dairy and cows. At that point, I knew somatic cell counts and mastitis were important to a dairy farmer, but I didn't really know much about the daily life. And I certainly didn't have a greater appreciation of how we could help.
Right. Yeah, and that's actually a really interesting path, to start from, harvesting potatoes and now working at this, precision dairy technology company. That's a very long and winding road. So I'm sure from all those experiences, it's helped you in your current position at SomaDetect. And so then, speaking of your position, so you are the manager of strategic partnerships for SomaDetect. So you connect with a lot of different industry stakeholders. What value can SomaDetect and artificial intelligence provide to these companies?
Yeah, I think there is so much value that is really hard to define at this point. From a product and technology standpoint at SomaDetect, we're really focused on building something for dairy farmers. But as we all know and have come to appreciate about the dairy industry is that it's supported by a lot of other industry segments, whether that's the folks who are providing genetics and consultation to help improve the genetic potential of the herd, or feed and nutrition, or even just developing software to help farms better manage their herds as their herd sizes grow. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that's one thing that it's hard to put a finger on exactly what that value is, but there's certainly lots of curious and interested minds. And so there's one thing that we could all stand to gain if we bring data from different systems together. Mm-hmm. But that work, I think, again, is really just starting to begin.
Right.
From a first science standpoint, one of the questions that I found most exciting to ponder from a broader industry standpoint is if there are any compounds in milk that we know about or we don't know about that could be used as a diagnostic tool if they were monitored inline in real time, what would those compounds be? Mm-hmm. And so, somatic cell count, fat, and protein, these are all compounds in milk that people are pretty familiar with and used to using on a, maybe not a daily basis, but a monthly basis, or certainly within an annual basis to manage their herd. Yeah. And so I'm sort of curious what those other things might be. And the reason that I'm curious about that is this really parallel path of development that I feel that SomaDetect is on that can be compared to other industries. And one that stands out in particular to me is this 2018 paper that was published in Nature by a researcher named Bryan Wattie. And they worked with a group of ophthalmologists where they took pictures of people's eyes, mm-hmm. and then the ophthalmologist, the doctor, assessed that picture to say, yeah, that person needs surgery and that person doesn't. So does that look like a picture of an eye of someone who needs surgery or not?
Right.
And they found that they could build a pretty good model. And so the nice thing about that was that they could have this mobile device that could send people to hospitals instead of needing to build hospitals in every small town.
Right.
And so that, improved the access of healthcare by making the cost of diagnosis much cheaper.
Right.
And also reducing the number of patients that you're sending to an expert for their care. Mm-hmm. So if for every person who doesn't need treatment, essentially, that a doctor sees, they're kind of wasting their time that could be spent with people who do need treatment. And so if we can optimize that process then the same thing can kind of be translated on to the farm of which cows actually have problems or not, which cows might need to see the veterinarian or not. And we do that a couple of different ways at SomaDetect, through different algorithms. Mm-hmm. But one of the other things that I found really interesting about that paper was that they found that they could detect other things that they hadn't originally set out to do. And in the same path, so has SomaDetect. So when we started, we were looking for somatic cell counts. And in our conversations with farmers, we found that there were other components that they were interested in and other things about their cows that they wanted to know, and that if they could know them at the time of milking, what a difference that might be.
Right.
And so we started to explore that question of, could we detect or determine these things from the data that was being produced by the sensor at the same time that we were trying to develop insights around somatic cell counts. And we found that we could determine fat protein ratios. We found that we could detect different levels of progesterone. And then we've also found that we can determine if a cow is pregnant or not. So the overall status of that cow, rather than the particular component level in the milk, from that picture as well. And in this other paper, they were also doing some of these very similar things. So amongst their test population, they found that they could, determine the risk of ocular disease, so whether or not someone needed surgery. But they could also determine age. And the doctors said, well, that makes sense. The picture of the back of the eye changes as someone ages. It'll change in shape and size and color. So it makes sense that there's an algorithm that can make that determination.
Right.
They also found that they could predict the gender, and there were no known features in the back of the eye that are known to indicate gender, but there was a solid AI algorithm that could differentiate from pictures of the back of the eye whether or not someone was male or female. In addition, they had outcomes that they didn't anticipate that were useful, like predicting the risk of cardiovascular disease. So at the back of the eye, you have all these little veins, and it turns out that some of the characteristics of those veins also are linked to cardiovascular disease and risks associated with that. And so that was just an outcome that they weren't expecting, but because they had collected this data, they could go back and say, well, what can we determine from these images? And so in a similar way, when we're developing these light scattering patterns, we can, as long as we have this data to ask that question, we can go back and see. And I really, continue to have my curiosity fueled by asking that question of what else could we potentially detect.
Right. Yeah, and that is really interesting. Even comparing that to that study with those eye exams, and even discovering, like you're mentioning, with the different genders and that sort of thing. That was completely unpredicted, right? And then from that data, they were able to find that. So who knows what else could be out there that we could kind of correlate with the things that we're finding right now. So no, that's very interesting. So then in some of that same topic, with dairy farmers in specific, how are they benefiting directly from artificial intelligence today? And what do you think is next for artificial intelligence within dairy? And you did touch upon this a little bit, but I'd like to really dive into the dairy farmer specific benefits around artificial intelligence.
Yeah. So, I'm not really in a position to comment on the ins and outs of other companies' technologies and whether or not they're using AI in, let's say, their wearables or in their robotics. But I'm sure that there are applications like that. And it certainly all comes down to, I think, improving data analysis, interpretation, leading to decision support tools. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of, that I guess kind of depends on your philosophy of AI is, where does that chain end? Does it end so that you have a tool that helps the farm, or is the goal to eventually replace all human decision making? Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'm on that end of the spectrum. I think that there's still loads of value that can be extracted from a human that will be very difficult to replicate with AI. Mm-hmm. And so these decision support tools is definitely where I see that going. From SomaDetect's perspective, I think it kind of has different layers, right? We're first figuring out what would it mean if we have somatic cell counts from every cow at every milking. Are there clear patterns that allow us to distinguish, which cows are healthy or not? Mm-hmm. And then once we know that, can we also use that in a decision-making process about what to do to treat that cow? And then it'll be very exciting to investigate how that has an impact on different performance parameters around mastitis management. So how many cases are occurring? What's the cure rate? Are cows actually getting better? Do we have to treat them as long as we used to in order to get to that cure rate? And ultimately, are we reducing antibiotic usage on the farm?
Right.
I think that question has another layer where you say, well, okay, if we have STC from every cow at every milking, can we use that to predict when mastitis might occur? So are there like these little patterns or these little signals that happen in the data before the cow gets sick that could enable us to intervene even sooner and develop new standards of care and new best management practices? Maybe not using antibiotics at all.
Right.
And that would be pretty significant. And then the third layer of that is, can we bring data from different systems together to also make these determinations, perhaps at an improved level of performance, and even make these predictions with more and more accuracy and potentially opportunity to intervene for the ultimate decision maker on the farm.
Right. Yeah, and those are a lot of really great points. Even talking about what you're saying with the antibiotics, right? And really talking about optimizing that herd health and optimizing a farmer's management for herd health. And you mentioned a little bit about some of those other technologies, right? And them playing together. So then, speaking to those other technologies, what have you seen from them in terms of how they've evolved within the dairy industry? We talk about SomaDetect, of course. We have an inline sensor for the milk, but what are some of those other technologies that you've seen within the dairy industry?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about cow level or even sort of harder technologies, the two that come to mind for me are wearables and computer vision. And they're both used in robotics to some degree. Computer vision is one that I'm more familiar with. I had studied it in my undergrad, looking at different aspects of computer vision for food quality analysis. And it was certainly what initially got me pretty excited about SomaDetect, but my excitement has grown into many domains since then. And so, all of the robots would be using some aspect of computer vision to be finding an udder, cleaning it, and attaching the cups. But there are also companies like This and Cattle Care and Cattle Eye that are all trying to offer essentially like this virtual eye on the herd for things like feed management and other things that you could be visually assessing. So one interesting question to ask is like, are there things that I can see? And is that a real pattern that then a computer could see? And what would a computer need in order to make those determinations? And one of the big pieces there is the identification of an individual animal. There are some things you can do in a barn that don't require identification of individual animals, and I think these companies are pursuing some of that. But the individual animal one is definitely, I think, part of many of it would make sense that it would be part of all of their different product development pipelines. Right. It'll be really interesting to see how that comes to market.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely, looking at that individual animal, it also really goes back to the farmer being able to make some of those individual decisions on that animal, right? Then basing off of data from the entire herd. So then, you've met many players in the dairy industry, companies that specialize in animal pharma, reproduction, nutrition. How do you see artificial intelligence impacting the future of those companies?
Yeah. So, on the flip side of the previous question too, when we asked, about technology, we're talking. I mentioned things like cameras and the associated processing of that data, or wearables and the associated processing of that data. But from a technology standpoint, you could also talk about big data and AI and some of the systems that it just takes to enable AI to be used. And you could look at a couple of different industry players, whether it's a herd management software like BAS's DairyComp that tries to pull data together from lots of different systems on a farm. More broadly, you might see a company like My Dairy Dashboard. And from a decision support standpoint, you see initiatives like the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Dairy Brain Project, where they're trying to bring all this data together to actually end up at those decisions for the producer. And I think the data science aspect of dairy can definitely be another thing to keep an eye on. And then when we break that down by segment, I find that it's a little bit easier for me to point on to some of the specifics around SomaDetect's AI technology than AI more broadly for their companies. But if we had an AI-enabled inline sensor on a lot of different farms, what could that mean for a processor? And what could they learn about their supply chain in real time? Could they know if there were tanks that maybe didn't need to be picked up or should go to because they've been contaminated, or ones that would be better suited for cheese than for yogurt, and so we're going to send it to that plant instead of this plant because we have a few plants within our milk shed. Not all milk routes have that option. It's going to go to the same plant one way or the other, but others, there might be an opportunity to optimize for the product that you're producing. Right. And for a genetics company, you might look at this data and say, okay, if I've got fat and protein data, even if it's not as precise as the lab, but if I have it for every cow at every milking, can I start to use some of that decision data in my decisions for which cows to rebreed to what sires in order to advance my herd in the direction that I want it to be advancing. Right. And certainly today, in the face of COVID-19, I think some of the big questions are what types of data are available on the farm or can be made available on the farm for especially veterinarians who are going to see increasing usage of telemedicine in their practices. What data do those practitioners need to maximize the value that they can create for their clients at a distance? I think those are some of the specific segments that we'll be seeing lots of collaboration opportunities come in the next few months and years.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. I've seen a lot of people talking about, this digitization of data, particularly when talking about COVID-19. There's so many ways that companies are now looking at like telemedicine, looking at some of these more virtual ways to get things done. And it's very much shifted, I think, a lot of that, that ideology and openness more towards, digital solutions and data. So then one more question before we close for today. How do you see artificial intelligence changing the way farmers milk their cows? And I know you've alluded to this a little bit in some of your previous responses, talking about the connection between all different areas within the dairy industry. But I wanted to see if you wanted to add anything in particular about how it will change, specifically the milking of the cows for farmers.
Yeah, I think that there's a few things that it could change. The most immediate bottom line, right, is the sustainability and economic sustainability of the operation. So if a farm is striving to keep their costs of production low and continue to lower them, the more value that you can drive from your data and the more things that you can automate, the lower those costs will be, and the higher your margin on the other side of it could be too. So that's one, pretty big piece.
For sure.
I'm sorry, I had something else that really came to mind there. Oh, the other piece, of with this growing data source, what I think it could also enable is more margin on the other side. And so, we hear a lot in the dairy industry about shifting consumer demands, whether that's around animal welfare or for, more variety or better understanding of locality or methods of production, or whatever the case may be. That with more sensor technology, with more data, what we could see is more differentiation within the supply chain, as well as just a little bit more visibility. And I think that visibility is something that the industry sort of struggles with in terms of creating trust.
Right.
There's always two sides to a coin, and what I really respect about dairy farmers is their dedication to their craft and their animals. And what I feel like is missing, and I think this doesn't just apply to dairy, but to many different aspects of food production at the consumer level, is an appreciation of how much effort it takes to take that crop from planting all the way to consumption.
Right.
And certainly in animal agriculture, that becomes a lot more complicated, and there's a lot more variability to be managing. And so, I have an enormous amount of respect for the dairy farmers that we work with and how they manage all of those different moving targets. And so any way we can help there, I look forward to that.
Yeah, and so do I. Yeah, there's, even for myself, I've learned so much about dairy farmers and dairy farming and everything it takes to, raise a cow. And it's definitely, it's hard work. And a lot of respect for the dairy farmers. Well, wonderful. Thank you, Bryan. That concludes our interview for today. Thank you for taking the time to discuss artificial intelligence, dairy technology, and everything else within the dairy industry. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Rachel. This is great.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for those tuning in today. If you want to learn more about SomaDetect, feel free to check out our website at www.somadetect.com. Until then, see you next time.